Salvation's Edge has been out a month. If you were to ask me a month ago how I thought this raid fared, I would say that it was the best raid in Destiny's history. Now that the hype has calmed down and critically examining this raid for its mechanics, for its encounters, for its bosses, for its level design, for its lore, for really everything that goes into this raid, it's probably better than most raids in Destiny's history, but it's not the best. To say where exactly I would rate the raid compared to others, I would say it's top 3, but it's not number 1. I don't think it's good enough to be number 1. Disclaimer for the rest of the video, if you haven't been able to gauge already, this is just my opinion. I'm sure you're going to disagree with me. Some people think that this raid is the best in Destiny's history. Some people think it's the worst because of one specific encounter we're going to talk about later. But besides that, let me know what you think. Let me know how you think it stacks up in the comment section down below. And sit back and enjoy the video. Starting off with the first encounter, Substratum. I think that this is a phenomenal, fantastic way to start a raid. It teaches you everything you need to know, and it imprints in you some of the ideas that are required for this raid going forward. That being, Resonance is going to be there for every single encounter. Yes, even Verity, that you're going to be working independently in separate teams for the vast majority of this raid, that you can't rely on having 6 at all time, that you're going to need your numbers to be between 3 and 2 for most of this raid. And it also teaches you that there are harsh consequences for not being in time with your teammates and failing the mechanics. Communication is key with this thing. There is no hard fail to this encounter besides dying or besides the time running out. And to maximize your time, you need to be communicating with your team and getting the most out of the ping pong system. For those of you who don't know, at the beginning of your encounter, you enter the room and you deposit a resonance into a box. That's how it teaches you that the resonance is supposed to go in the box. And in the room that you are in, the room is incredibly wacky, but 2 doors open, and from those doors, harpies flow out. You have to kill those harpies, and then it's kind of taught to you that you need to go in as 2 teams of 3 to these rooms and just work your way through the rooms. Eventually, a Tormentor is going to spawn, a Hydra is going to spawn, a Omen of the Witness is going to spawn. These are all mandatory enemies you need to kill to trigger the next phase of mechanics, and that phase of mechanics being ping-ponging resonance between 2 rooms and stacking it so that you can deposit it in the pillars and then deposit it back into the center of the room. Boiling down the mechanics like this takes away the complexity of the timing that's required to maximize your efficiency in this encounter and make sure that you're not making it harder than it needs to be. This is a remarkably simple encounter as long as you remember to bring anti-champion gear, specifically Overload, and have something that can deal with a Tormentor and an Omen. This encounter is as fast as you make it. There's nothing intentionally slowing you down. It's really on your skill as a group of players to make this encounter either go as fast or as slow as you want it to go. And as a player, this is great. A design mechanic that rewards you for specifically being good means that it's going to maximize speedrunning, it's going to maximize casual plays, it's going to maximize people who are just sweaty, try hard, trying to get this done in less than 30 minutes because they got some other stuff to do. This encounter, however, isn't perfect. It isn't perfect in 2 ways, one of which being the big witness hand that comes out of the ceilings and does bombs. Notably, this really doesn't affect your ability to play the game, but it's still something that gets in the way, and the game doesn't explain to you or communicate with you in any effective way that this isn't something you can interact with. It's almost taunting you as if to say, hey, this is going to be relevant later. Wink, wink, cough, cough. It is, but I still take problem with having a stage hazard that you cannot do anything to mitigate besides simply annoying it. I can't begin to tell you the amount of time that my team spent on the first day of this raid trying to figure out if the hand in this encounter was something that we had to use or if it's just something that was there and was really annoying considering how quick it kills you if you stand in its aura. Besides that, this is a good encounter. I'm not going to give it a specific rating as this isn't the point of this video, but just my thoughts on this raid. I feel this is a fine encounter that nobody should have any problems with unless you as a team get confused when 2 teams of 3 are trying to communicate at the same time. The way the timing of this works means that really only one team should be calling out when the ping pongs are or when locking is, but that's just if you are being as good at the game as you can be. Another downside of this is you can get stuck in the rooms really easily, but that's just a minor gripe if you are lingering or lagging behind in the rooms. Your teammates can get you stuck in there if they phase it to the next part of the raid. Besides that, overall, Substratum, phenomenal. I like it. I wouldn't say that I love it. Is it the strongest of all of the opening encounters that we have ever seen? I don't think so, but it does come really close. It does a lot of things well. It is a fairly unproblematic encounter, and I am a big fan of it. Moving on to the second encounter, Dissipation. It is our first of our 2 boss encounters. I'll talk about that later, but we are fighting a basically reskinned Taniks. For starters, I hate the Taniks trope. I know it's been going on for 10 years now, but it's just really overplayed. I think they could have done a lot more, or really anything different, a new disciple, just anything that wasn't a Taniks clone for this encounter would have been greatly appreciated. I know it's not exactly the Taniks model, but it's easy to see what they were going for by including what is basically just a big fallen captain for the boss for the second encounter, Dissipation. But besides that, Dissipation is really just more of the same in the first encounter. It takes all the mechanics that you had in the first encounter and ups it by adding more resonance and breaking you into smaller teams. In this case, 3 teams of 2, or in the footage cases, 2 teams of 2 and 1 team of 1, because it's pretty easy to well-man this raid with 4 people. In this case, we were doing it with 5, and it all worked out really well in terms of mechanics, but our damage wasn't that optimized. That's just this specific run. Onto the actual nitty-gritty nuts and bolts of this thing. Like I said, this is just more of the first encounter. It has the same ping pongs, it just has more resonance. It has a stage hazard in the hand that comes up from the ground rather than down from the ceiling, and that's something you have to manage. It's not as big of a problem because you don't really have to interact with it that much. The only time it runs or deals with you is when you have to run to the center of the arena, and you might run into it sometimes. Besides all the normal first encounter mechanics, 1 person on each side is going to get called to Reckoning, in which case they have to run down into the center of the arena and basically 1v1 the Herald, in which case you just shoot his head, some blights spawn, you shoot 3 of the blights, and then you shoot his head once all the blights are destroyed, and then you get a buff that allows you to see which of the pillars you need to deposit the resonance in. Each side is only going to spawn 2 of the 3 resonant types, and it's going to be one of those 2 types that spawns per side. It is relatively idiot-proof. It's just whether or not you know your shapes. Contrary to what most people say, the only thing I don't like about this encounter is the boss portion of it. I think that the boss is incredibly weak and incredibly disappointing. I'm never a fan of the big enemy trope if it isn't something special, if it isn't something unique. This is just a big taken captain with a mechanic outside of its own control that you have to deal with. It's a well-made encounter, it works, its mechanics work as long as you understand how to do them. Really, this encounter is down to your skill as a player. There's nothing BS, there's no randomization, it's easy to learn the mechanics. Everybody should have a job to do, and there's no reason why they shouldn't be doing it. This is a perfectly serviceable encounter. Like I said, I'm not going to beat a dead horse, I just do not like the boss portion of this. And I also love how in the damage phase, you just 1v1, you get up close and personal. Now, if this was another boss per se, Crota, even though Crota is just a big hive knight, it's a little bit different. The sauce factor is a little bit different when he doesn't have any other abilities, whereas the Herald of Finality is relatively tame. It heavily incentivizes you to do damage in one specific way, that is use swords. The crit modifier on this guy really isn't anything to write home about, and it's so small and he moves around so many times, it punishes you for trying to use precision weapons to kill him. Thus, most people just default to swords. Just some finishing thoughts. This encounter is stronger than the opening encounter just because it's a boss encounter and adds more onto the first. Thus, by my own sake, my own logic, it can't be worse than the encounter that came before it because it's just more of the same, and it's also just relatively well designed. Moving on to the third encounter, Repository. This is my least favorite encounter in the raid, and I'll explain why. There's a phrase that goes, some things overstay their welcome, and with this encounter, the mechanics greatly overstay their welcome. This is now the 3rd time in a row we're reusing the same mechanics, when in most instances, you are only reusing the same core mechanics for 2 encounters in a row, or something new or something interesting is being introduced. This is just a different variation of the ping pong plus resonance puzzle that we have seen 3 times. The only difference is that this encounter repository takes a lot of inspiration from Exhibition. It's broken into 3 rooms. You can't practice in the later rooms unless you actually are good enough to get there in the first place, and with enough repetition, eventually you're just going to learn everything that's going on, and that really isn't an issue. But on first time runs, this encounter is the least beginner friendly besides one. Now, there's really no sense in explaining the mechanics because I've already explained them 2 times. You ping pong, you pick up resonance, you deposit the resonance. This is a very, very simple, it is a very basic encounter. You just run through each individual room with nothing to change. The only difference is there is no difference. In addition, the new witness hand is introduced, the one that pops out from the wall and shoots a big ol' line at you. This is my favorite hand. This is the hand that was my enemy during the day 1. Because I don't want to yap, I have nothing interesting to say about this encounter. I already dislike Exhibition for Vow of the Disciple. I already am getting tired of the ping pong mechanic from the previous 2 encounters. I think that in this raid, if any of the first 3 encounters are switched, I really see no reason why. The only reason why these encounters are progressively getting more hard are for 2 things: enemy density, amount of variance in enemies, and the amount of resonance that you need to manage. In the first encounter, you only manage 1 resonance. In the second encounter, you only manage 2 resonance per team. And in the third encounter, you have to manage all 3 resonance types at the same time. That is the only thing that escalates the difficulty, and in my opinion, that is the only thing that makes these stand apart from each other. If you were to take this encounter and per se only make it so that triangle spawns, this could very easily be the first encounter of the raid. It feels like 3 encounters were designed to be beginner friendly, to be understandable. The real difficulty in this comes from the dread enemy type, that being the tormentors and the omens. Those are always difficult to deal with if you don't have weapons or if you don't have, good teammates helping you out. But this encounter really doesn't have any pizzazz, Like I said, it's the same thing 3 times in a row. I've ran out of things to say about this encounter 2 minutes ago, besides just complaining about the general design of Salvation's Edge. And this is part of the reason why I don't think it can be the #1 raid encounter in Destiny's history, despite being the pinnacle of the 10-year story that we've been seeing. Off of a quick rating, if I had to rate this encounter in the upper half versus the bottom half of the 60 or so raid encounters that we have seen in Destiny, I would rate this in the upper half. It's well designed, even if the design has overstayed its welcome. It actually works 100% of the time, which is something that you can't say for some of these other raids, but I think it's probably top 40. I don't think it gets into the top 30, but that's a list I'm going to reevaluate coming up soon, and just going to move on to the 4th encounter, the one everybody's been waiting to see, I presume. I have a love-hate relationship with Encounter 4, Vault 2.0, Verity. On one hand, I think once you understand the mechanics of this encounter, it is relatively easy. It is just a time sink that takes no more, no less than 10 minutes every time you go through this raid, because it works on eternal timers that you can't speed up at all. Even if you're doing well, the mechanics still take a set amount of time to occur, and there's not a lot you can do to get around that. Because I passed high school geometry, the shapes were never an issue for me, and because I have the reading comprehension of somebody who's passed 3rd grade, I can actually read when things are happening, and I know how to tell the difference between Guardians. I feel like this is the most unique puzzle encounter we have ever seen, but that's just it. It is a puzzle encounter. Once you have done it once, you've completed it for the rest of your life. Once you understand how to do it once, you're never going to have any issues with this ever again, unless you're teaching somebody who doesn't understand the puzzle. There's no real challenge from the enemies. There's not a lot of enemy density. They don't throw a lot of enemies that can kill you in one shot at you. The biggest issue with this is the dread fools that give you tinnitus whenever they shout at you, stopping you from moving, and the unstoppable ogres. But those are issues that we've been dealing with for nigh on a decade now. It's not that big of a deal to just have someone who's really good at ad clear. There are a lot of you freaks out there who are really good at ad clear. Don't get me wrong. But puzzle encounters like this just don't impress me anymore. The amount of skill it takes to complete this only depends on your ability to effectively communicate mechanics to somebody who has never seen it before. One Datto video, 20 minutes analyzing footage, somebody knows how to do this for the rest of their lives. There's no real challenge to it besides the fact that there is no feedback. There's no feedback to tell you when you're doing stuff wrong, when you're doing stuff right, until you've actually completed the encounter. You can see the shadows moving on the wall. You can see the light ball lock in place on the ceiling. You can see a couple of things, but none of it to tell you in the moment when people were figuring it out. This was the great filter for the day one, in the same way that Vault was the great filter for Last Wish, and this is pretty much the reason why only one team completed this raid within the first 24 hours. It's a double-edged sword because I like going through and replaying this encounter. However, I don't like having to actually explain the mechanics to people. I'm not a very patient Sherpa. I don't do a lot of Sherpas for this raid. Maybe that's something I'll change in the future for this raid specifically, but this just gives me nightmares trying to teach it to new people. Do I think this encounter deserves top 10? Do I think it deserves top 20? Not particularly. I think it is about in the same place as Vault was. If anything, I think Vault is a little better than this one, specifically just because of the lack of feedback, the lack of insta-kills, the lack of doing something wrong and losing everything like Vault has. It's a lot easier to make mistakes and to build habits that are going to screw you in the long run due to the design of Bungie wanting to make an encounter that nobody, not even their own raid team except for the people who were coding this encounter, could understand. Finally, moving on to Mr. Kitty Cat Eyes, the bitness, the thickness, the witness himself. I'm just going to say it straight up. This is a disappointing boss fight. I'm sorry for those of you who like it. I do not like fighting the Witness. Besides my own expectations of the raid, for a final boss who's supposed to be the be-all, end-all Armageddon, he sure just does a lot of standing around. He doesn't shoot at you. His main body doesn't shoot at you. He has his arms and his minions do that work if you're standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. But besides that, he's just a big nothing burger. You just do a bunch of mechanics and then you pull it to the middle. There's other raid bosses that will actually fire back and fight back you. I think Crota is a better final boss. I think Oryx is a better final boss. I think Axis is a final boss. Bosses that actually interact with the player. You can say that, oh, the Witness has hands around the arena. No, his appendages don't really count. They're not an actual threat unless you are intentionally trying to die to them. That's the key purpose. If you are intentionally trying to get hit by these things, to stand in the aura, to proc the resonance, to be able to trigger the Cliffbreaker, that is really the only time that these things are a threat. The Witness is better than Verity in that it actually explains its mechanics through context clues once you figure out how to shoot the square, to shoot the circle, or to shoot the triangle when you're trying to avoid the insta-kill mechanic. I feel like it's very easy to learn that and understand why something is happening. On average, I think that the Witness is better than the vast majority of encounters in the game, but it is not an elite boss fight, and for that I am severely disappointed. The enemy density is good, the enemy variety is technically good, because I do, unfortunately, like the Dread as a faction, despite the fact that the Omens that are Stasis are garbage, and the Omens that are Strand will suspend you in the worst of times. It's just one of those things where I can't explain why I like fighting these guys, but I just do like fighting them. And besides, after the Witness himself, despite what Bungie assured us, it is just another final boss where you stand on a plate and you shoot it. In this case, you're limited to where you can stand because you have to be, on this platform to actually shoot the boss by getting the Surging Light infinite light buff. It's basically, I understand that the bosses have to give you the tool of your own destruction, but, standing on a plate is something that I wished we could have avoided. Now, I'm not suggesting doing a mechanic to deal damage to the Witness, but I think that it might have been useful having something in the background that you could have used to do damage to the Witness. But that's not me criticizing the design of the Witness, it's me saying what I would do different personally. And besides that, during the actual damage phase, the things he does with his hands, where you have to jump and you have to move front and back, I feel like playing DDR at the same time as you're dealing damage to the final boss, it's not as bad as people say it is. Okay, once you can very easily tell where his hands are going to go and which sides you're going to need to run to avoid the resonance blast that, if not insta-kill you, will get you one shot and leads you to die to literally anything else. Besides that, In terms of the actual loot of the raid, all of the loot's good. I like all of it. I don't have a problem with any of it. Everything feels like it has its use, except for maybe the sword, but the sword isn't something I have done extensive build crafting with yet, so I can't even fairly judge it on that. I think that the exotic Euphony is a little bit clanky, but it does have a lot of potentials. Unfortunately for me, the potential is really only viable on Warlock. I like the idea of having weapons that are more viable on other classes. You know, like having Still Hunt is more viable on Hunters, like having Euphony is more viable on Warlocks, and something like, I don't know, Sweet Business if you're trying to be funny, or Xenophage is more viable on Titans if you're using certain builds. Some of you might have noticed at this point that I haven't talked about the traversal sections for this raid. Why? Because I don't consider them to be encounters. I know some people are severely confused as to what the definition of encounter is. Really, if you look in your tribes and it says you have to complete X, that being an encounter, the first encounter, second encounter, third, fourth, the named ones that have a defined beginning darkness zone and ending darkness zone, and an objective to complete, not just running around like a chicken with your head chopped off trying to go from A to B as quickly as possible. But I thought the jumping sections were okay. They didn't take too long. They were complex enough with enough enemies to slog your way through. There are some points where it's a little bit unfair, specifically going between the fourth encounter and the fifth encounter. Climbing the Pillar of the Witness I thought was a really, really cool moment that was ruined by having enemies there. Think more the spacewalk in Deepstone Crypt. That is the best traversal section we have ever seen. Every moment, every millisecond of that is just amazing. But I'm not here to gush about Deepstone Crypt. I'm here to tell you whether or not I think Salvation's Edge is a good raid and whether or not it deserves to be up there with the best raids in Destiny's history. And that answer is yes. Despite my problems with some of the encounters, the repetition and the overdoing the mechanics, and what I expected this raid to be, I do think Bungie knocked it out of the park for a few reasons. One, it's fun to play. It's not frustrating once you actually know the mechanics. It's not frustrating on repeat playthroughs unless you're trying to teach somebody, and even then, once you teach them, they're taught for life pretty much. The loot is good, the setting is good, the stakes, understand the stakes. It's a little bit disappointing that you don't kill the witness at the end of it, but I understand that that's something that they can't exclude 99% of the player base just to have a satisfying ending to a raid. But Excision, the 12-man activity, is a satisfying ending to the Destiny story, I feel. Just so I can stop being a milquetoast fence sitter, I'm going to tell you where this raid ranks to all the others in a separate video. Until then, I want to thank each and every single one of you for watching. This is a great raid. Like I said, it's top 3, but it's not number 1. It's probably 2 or 3 on a good day. It's a 2, on a bad day it's a 3, depending on how I'm feeling after teaching somebody. But this raid has too much repetition, too much blending of encounters, too much reusing of old mechanics. They're saving time, they saved money, they made a good raid, but because of that, they did not make the best raid in Destiny's history. However, this does fit the bill. It's worth a playing. I recommend everyone try to play this either through a friend, through a clan, through Big LFG, through Fireteam Finder. If you can't play this raid, find a way to play it. I promise you, you will thank yourself. Besides that, I want to thank each and every single one of you watching this video. I'm going to try to upload more. I'm going to try to get out a couple more lists done in the future. I'm redoing the Catalyst video next week or in the next 2 weeks when the Red Death Catalyst comes out, so please stay tuned for that. I have some plans, working on some more scripted videos like this one, and besides that, thank you all for watching. Take care now.